Chapter 22. At the big bend of the mussel shell, he took from a cache the keg of rum, the kettle, and a few other things, and then sat on the bay and looked west and south, wondering if he should take the safer way over the Teton Pass or the more dangerous way by Three Forks. Storm determined it. It was snowing this morning, and all the signs said it would be an early and a long, hard winter. If he went by the pass, it would take twice as long, and he might find himself snowbound up against the Tetons or the southern Bitterroots. By far the easier route was by Three Forks, where John Colter had made his incredible run to freedom, where the Indian girl who went west with Lewis and Clark had been captured as a child, and where beaver were thickest in all the western land. It was there also that more than one trapper had fallen under the arrows or bullets of the Blackfeet. It was a foolhardy decision, but mountain men were foolhardy men. For 150 miles, with snow falling on him most of the way, he went up the river and then followed a creek through a mountain pass. He was leaving a trail that a blind Indian could follow. Straight ahead now was the Missouri. On coming to it, he went up it to the Three Forks, the junction of the Gallatin, Madison, and Jefferson rivers. He knew this area fairly well. Lewis and Clark had gone up the Jefferson River, which came down from the west, but Sam planned to go southwest and cut across to a group of hot springs in dense forest. The snow was almost a foot deep now and still falling, but he had seen no tracks of redmen, only of wild beasts, and he had no sense of danger. Just the same, he hastened out of the Three Forks area, eager to lose his path in forested mountains. He might have made it if pity hadn't overthrown prudence. He had gone up the Beaverhead, past a mountainous mass on his left, and hot springs that would be known as the Potosi, and had then ridden straight west to a group of hot springs deep in the magnificent forest, when suddenly he came in view of a mountain tragedy that stopped him. Two great bulls of the Wapiti, or elk family, had been fighting and had got their horns locked, and a pack of wolves was circling them, while turkey buzzards sat in treetops, looking down. Sam saw at once that it had been a terrific fight. The earth was torn, and the brush trampled over half an acre. The two bulls looked evenly matched, each with a handsome set of antlers and beautifully muscled shoulders and neck. Sam had sometimes wondered why the Creator had put such an immense growth of bone on the head of elk and moose. Their antlers were about all their necks could carry, much less handle on a run through heavy timber or in a fight with another bull. It was not an uncommon thing to find bulls dead with horns entangled in dense underbrush or interlocked as now. These two had their rumps up in the air to the full length of their hind legs, but both were on their knees and unable to move their heads at all. Any moment the wolves would have moved in to hamstring them and bring them down, and feast in their bellies while they still breathed. If Sam had found one bull dead and the other bugling over him, he would have thought it all right. But to find two magnificent warriors unable to continue their fight, who deeply wanted to, was such an ironic miscarriage of the divine plan that he was outraged. He would set them free if he could, so they could resume their fight. Sam looked round him and listened. Thinking that he was many miles from danger, he secured his horses to a tree, hung his rifle from the saddle horn, and walked about 100 feet to the bulls. He went close to them to study the interlocking of the antlers. The astonishing thing about it was that bulls were able to do it. Sam had heard men say that they had taken two antlered heads and tried for hours to get the horns inextricably locked. These two sets were so firmly and securely the prisoners of one another that it looked to Sam as if he would have to cut through 2 or 3 bones to set them free. He had no saw, but he had a hatchet. While considering the matter, he walked around the two beasts, studying them with the practical eye of one who knew the good points of a fighter. Yes, indeed, they were well matched. He thought there was not 30 pounds difference in their weight. Their antlers had the same number of points, and in clay banks had been honed to the same sharpness. They had been in a great battle, all right. Their eyes were bloodshot. Their chin whiskers were clotted with the stuff that fury had blown from their nostrils, and both had been savagely raked along ribs and flank. What a handsome pair they were! Sam patted them on their quivering hams and said, "Old fellers, I calculate I'll have to chop some of your horns off. It'll hurt just enough to make you fight better." He again studied the antlers, so absorbed by the drama that he had been thinking only of the two warriors. He glanced over toward the horses, where his hatchet was, and turned rigid, his eyes opening wide with amazement. 7 Blackfeet braves had slipped soundlessly out of the forest, and 7 rifles were aimed at Sam's chest. 7 hideously painted red men were holding the rifles, their black eyes glittering and gleaming with triumph and anticipation, for they were thinking of rum and ransom and the acclaim of the Blackfeet nation. Why, in God's name, Sam wondered, hadn't he smelled them? It was because the odors of the elk and battle had filled his nostrils. In the instant when he saw the 7 guns aimed at his heart at a distance of 80 feet, Sam had also seen a horde of red devils around his horses. He knew that if he moved toward the revolvers at his belt, 7 guns would explode. Slowly he raised his hands. He had turned gray with anger and chagrin. This was the first time in his adult life that he had been taken completely by surprise. A Blackfeet warrior over 6 feet tall, broad and well-muscled, with the headdress of a sub-chief, now lowered his gun and came forward. He came up to Sam, and gloating black eyes looked into enraged blue-gray eyes, as red hands took the knife from its sheath and unbuckled the revolver belt. Guns and knife were tossed behind him. The chief then hawked phlegm up his throat, and putting his face no more than 12 inches from Sam's, and looking straight into his eyes, he exploded the mouthful into Sam's face. A tremor ran through the white man from head to feet. In that moment he could have killed the chief, but in the next he would have fallen under the guns. Other warriors now came over from the horses, all painted for battle. They began to dance around their captive, in the writhing, snake-like movements of which the red people were masters. Sam thought there were about 60 of them. He stood immobile, the saliva and mucus dripping from his brows and beard. His eyes cold with hate, he was fixing the chief's height and face in his mind, for he was already looking forward to vengeance. After a few moments the chief put aside his dignity and joined the dance. It seemed that all these warriors had rifles and long knives and tomahawks. In a victorious, writhing snake dance, they went round and round Sam, their black eyes flashing their contempt at him, and Sam looked at them and considered his plight. Now and then one gave shrieks of delight and redoubled his frenzies, or one, and then a second, and a third, would pause and aim their guns at Sam, or raise rifle or tomahawk as though to hurl it. Sam stood with his arms folded across his chest. In the way he looked at them, he tried to express his scorn, but these shrieking, writhing killers were children for whom the only contempt was their own. Not one of them had paid the slightest attention to the bulls with locked horns, or cared with what agonies or humiliation they died. When at last the Indians made preparations to take their prisoner and depart, they still paid no attention to the bulls. With loud, angry curses, and then with signs, Sam made them conscious of the two beasts, and they spat with contempt and said with signs that they had plenty of meat and would leave these to the wolves. Their insolence filled Sam with fresh rage. He was now less concerned for himself than for the helpless fighters who had a right to another chance, who in any case were too brave and too noble to die with wolves chewing into their bellies and with buzzards sitting on their horns. Speaking in tones that rang with anger and with angry signs, Sam told the chief that he should shoot the bulls, or chop a part of their horns off, or he should crawl off like a sick old woman and die with the rabbits. After appearing to give the matter some thought, the chief went to the beasts and looked at their horns. He shouted then to the warriors, and several of them ran over to him. He spoke again, and they put their muzzles at the base of the skulls and fired. The two bulls sank to the earth, locked together in death. Sam had been hoping that the Indians would break open the keg of rum and drink it here, but the wily chief had other plans. One plan was to humiliate and degrade the white man until he was delivered to the vengeance of the Crows. He would not be delivered with all possible dispatch. He would be taken north to the principal Blackfeet village, where the squaws could shriek round him and hurl dung and urine on him, and with the voices of ravens and magpies caw and gaggle and screech at him, and where the children, emulating their elders in ferocities and obscenities, could smear him with every foul thing they could find, and shoot arrows through his hair as he stood thonged and bound to a tree. Such thoughts were going through Sam's mind. He expected all that red cunning and ingenuity could devise, though he imagined that they wouldn't seriously wound him, or starve him until he could not walk, if they expected to collect a huge ransom. It would be childlike contempts and indignities all day and all night. These had begun when the chief exploded in his face. As soon as they had him manacled with stout leather ropes, the other warriors vied with one another in heaping abuse and insult upon him. With leather thongs soaked in the hot waters of a spring, they bound his hands together, and around the leather between his wrists was tied the end of a leather rope 30 feet long. A huge brave took the other end of the rope and made it secure to his saddle. Mounting his horse, he jerked the rope tight, and with pure devilment kept jerking it after taking his position in the line. About half the warriors went ahead of Sam, about half behind, with the chief at the rear, riding Sam's bay and leading the pack-horse. Now and then one of the red men, eager to torment the captive, would leave his position in the line, and breaking off a green chokecherry branch, he would slash stinging blows across Sam's defenseless face. With blood running from brow and cheek, Sam would look hard at the painted face, hoping to fix it in memory, and telling himself that these were the fiends who had slaughtered the defenseless family of the mother on the mussel shell. He had the face of the chief in memory. The red varmint had a scar about 3 inches long above the left eyebrow, and another scar just under the left chin. If with God's help he could ever free himself, he would hunt down that face. In some such manner as this, he supposed, they had taken Jesus to the hill, but Jesus had carried a great burden, under which he had fallen again and again, and when he fell, they spat on him and kicked him and cursed him. The one who had slashed at Sam's face had been rebuked by the chief, but his boldness had given ideas to other braves. And hour after hour, as Sam moved through heavy snowstorm, one man after another dropped out of line to hawk and spit on him, or hurl snow in his face, or make murderous gestures at him. After a while the braves seemed to understand that it was all right to show their contempt if they didn't wound him. And so by turns they hawked and spat and shrieked, or hurled snow, mud, and pine cones at his face. In their black eyes was a clear picture of what they wanted to do with him, for they knew not only that he was the Crow killer, but that he was the one who had scalped the 4 Blackfeet warriors and impaled their skulls on the stakes around the cabin. It was the snowfall that worried Sam more than the insults. This storm looked like the real thing. If winter was already setting in, and there was to be 3 or 4 feet of snow in the mountains in the next week or 2, as there sometimes was this far north, what good would escape do him, with the snow too deep to wade through? It would be a dim future for him if it kept snowing, and they meanwhile weakened him with starvation and cold. Why the red people so loved to torture their helpless captives was a riddle to all the mountain men. Sam thought it was because they were children. A lot of white children tortured things. Windy Bill said he could tell stories from childhood that would curdle the blood of a wolf. Sam had never heard of a white man who tortured a captive. Once when a wounded red man was singing his death song, Sam had seen Tomahawk Jack pick up a stone to knock the helpless Indian on the head, and had heard Mick Boone let off a howl of rage as he struck the stone from Jack's hand. "Shoot him decent-like if you wanna," Mick had roared. "He ain't no coyote." Sam had once seen a white man kick a wounded Indian in the belly and head. He had seen another scalp a red man while he was alive and conscious. But deliberate torture for torture's sake he thought he had never seen. Torture for the red men was as normal as beating their wives. The wolf ate his victim alive, but he wasn't aware of that. The blowfly hatched its eggs in the open wounds of helpless beasts, and maggots swarmed through the guts of an animal before its pain-filled eyes closed in death. The shrike impaled on horns the live babies of lark and thrush. The weasel and the stoat were ruthless killers. A horde of mosquitoes as thick as fog would suck so much blood from a deer or an elk that it would die of enervation, and sage ticks, bloated with blood until they were as large as a child's thumb, sometimes so completely covered an old beast that it seemed to be only all hair-bag of huge grey warts. But the red people tortured for the pure hellish joy of seeing a helpless thing suffer unspeakable agonies. It was chiefly for this reason that mountain men loathed them and killed them with as little emotion as they killed mosquitoes. If he could have done it, Sam would have struck all these warriors dead and ridden away with never a thought for them. As it was, his mind was on escape and vengeance. These red men knew, all the red people knew, that if ever a mountain man was affronted when helpless and treated with derision, contempt, mockery, and filth, the mountain men would come together to avenge the wrong, and that the vengeance would be swift, merciless, and devastating. Sam had no doubt that this chief knew it. There could be only one thought in his mind, that this captive would never escape from the Blackfeet or from the Crows, and that mountain men would never know what became of him. The chief would take his captive to his people so that they could gloat over him and see with their own eyes that he was not invincible after all, that he had been captured by the Bloods, mightiest of warriors, boldest and most fearless and most feared and most envied of all fighting men on earth. Sam thought that he might be slapped, spat on, kicked, knocked down, but not severely injured, that some of the squaws might squat over him, that children might drag their filthy fingers through his hair and beard, and pluck at his eyelids, and threaten his privates, and that dogs of the village might howl into the heavens their eagerness to attack him. He would be given once a day a quart of foul soup, with ants and beetles and crickets in it, for the red people knew that some of their food made white people gag, and this kind they took delight in forcing on white captives. For as long as he was a prisoner, that would be his fate. Then 400 warriors in full war paint and regalia would march off with him in the direction of the Crow Nation. On arriving at the border between the two nations, they would encamp and kill 100 buffalo, and feast and sing and dance, while scouts went forth to tell the old chief that his enemy was bound and helpless. For days the wiliest and craftiest old men in the two nations would haggle and dispute over the size of the ransom. The Bloods would demand many kegs of rum, many rides, a ton of ammunition, at least 400 of their finest horses, and piles of their beaded buckskin. The Crows would give no more than a tithe of what was demanded. The Bloods knew that. They would ask for 100, hoping for 50, prepared to settle for 20, even for 10, plus the privilege of watching the torture of Sam Minard. Well, if it kept snowing this way, they couldn't take him to the Crows before late spring. If he wasn't able to escape, he would have a long winter of starvation and cold and insults. Sam didn't for a moment intend to be delivered to the Crows. He didn't believe that the Creator would allow a man to be taken and tortured and killed for no reason, but that he had sought vengeance for the murder of his wife and child. The Holy Book said that God claimed vengeance as his own. In Sam's book of life, it was a law that man best served the divine plan who made a supreme effort to help himself. Sam intended his effort to be supreme. Now and then, while trudging along, he looked down at the elkskin that bound his wrists. If he got a good chance, he could chew it in two, but he knew that when he was not marching, his hands would be bound behind him. To sever tough leather rope when his hands were behind him would be impossible unless he could abrade it against something hard and sharp, such as stone, a split bone, or wood. During the nights he would have one guard, or possibly two. He would have to eat what they gave him to eat, no matter what it was, and preserve his strength as well as he could. He would do his best to sleep a good part of each night. He would act as if resigned to his fate. If only they would make camp and open the rum. The day of his capture they moved without pause until almost midnight. All day long a heavy snow fell. While walking in the deep, wide trail made by those ahead of him, Sam tried to look through the storm to the mountains round about. By branches on trees he knew they were going north. He supposed that this war party would traverse mountain valleys and passes west of the Missouri until they came to the Big Bend, where, he had heard, they had a large village on Sun River and another over on the Marias. They might take him all the way to Canada, but he doubted that they would, for if they did, it would be a long journey to the Crows. By the time dusk fell, he thought he had been walking about 5 hours. He was hungry. When his bound hands reached down to get snow for his thirst, the savage on the horse ahead of him would jerk at the rope and try to shake the snow out of his hands. He was a mean critter, that one. Sam would clench the snow in his palms to hold it, but the moment he moved hands toward his mouth, the watchful redskin would jerk at the rope with all his might. Sam said aloud to him, "I reckon I better fix your face in my mind, for somewhere, someday, we might have a hugging match." When a third or a fourth time the Indian jerked the rope, Sam, in sudden rage, swung his arms to the right and far back, hoping to break the Indian's grasp on the other end. But the other end was tied round the saddle horn. To punish Sam, the Indian kept jerking at the rope, and rage in Sam grew to such violence that it took all his will to restrain the forward rush to seize and strangle his foe. "I'd best come down," he thought, for if he got weak and fell, he would be dragged along like a dead coyote. His time would come. He refused to think of alternatives. His time would come, somewhere, and he would hear bones crack in the Indian's neck, and he would see the black eyes pop out of the skull as though pushed from behind. When at last at midnight the party made camp, Sam was tied to a tree and put under guard. Snow was still falling. The snow where he was to stand, sit, or lie during the remainder of the night was about 18 inches deep, a third of it new snow. If the storm broke away, it would be a bitter night. He didn't expect them to give him a blanket or a robe. He would be surprised if they gave him food. They would want to weaken him some. He would sit or lie by the tree all night with the storm covering him over, and at daylight he would march again. The man assigned to guard him had a large rope. It looked to Sam like one of his own, on a part of which he sat, with the remainder up over his shoulders and head, like a great furry cape. He had a rifle across his lap and a long knife at his waist. Under his fur tent he sat, immobile, sheltered, warm, his black eyes never leaving Sam's face, save now and then to glance at his hands. Sam wondered if this would be his only guard. If so, and if the man dozed, Sam could chew at the bonds. He knew that it would take his strong teeth an hour or two to chew through the tough, wet leather. And he knew that 2 or 3 minutes would likely be all the time he would have. About 50 feet beyond him and the guard, the party had pitched camp and built fires. But Sam could see no sign of rum drinking. Possibly they would not drink until they came to the village. About an hour after the first fire was built, he saw a warrior coming toward him with something in his hands. As the red man drew near, Sam saw that it was one of his own tin cups, or one just like it, and that the cup was steaming. The Indian proffered the cup, and Sam took it, knowing that this was his supper. And after the Indian had gone away, he looked into the cup and sniffed at its steam. He didn't know what was in the cup, but his grim humor imagined that it was a stew of coprophagous insects. There was almost a pint of it. All through the soup he could see what looked like hairs and small bugs, but with both hands he put the cup to his mouth and gulped the contents. 2 or 3 small pieces of half-cooked flesh he chewed. 10 feet from him the guard ate his supper, his eyes fixed most of the time on Sam. Sam set the tin cup aside. With snow he washed the beard around his mouth. Under him he felt the wetness of melting snow. His rump and thighs itched in wet leather. If he had to march day after day in deep snow paths and eat only this thin slop, he would need sleep. But how could a man sleep with melting snow under and over him. Before morning he would be chilled through. One thing was now plain to him. When a man faced torture and death, he was forced to do some thinking. Looking up through the lovely swirling flakes, he told himself that if the Creator was almighty, there was justice in the world. And if that were so, there would be justice here, for him. He suspected that this was a childish thought, but it comforted him. It comforted him to reach emotionally across the wintry desolation to the shack where Kate sat, talking to her children, with the snow falling white on her gray hair. While thinking of her, alone and half-frozen and facing a bitter winter, there came a flash of recognition that made him pause in his breathing. In this war party were some of the braves who had slaughtered her family. The brute who had jerked the rope was one of them. They knew they had in their power the man who had set the 4 Blackfeet heads on the stakes. What a struggle must be convulsing their wild, savage souls as they wavered between avarice and bloodlust. How they would have loved to drink the white man's firewater, while with insane shrieks they hacked his flesh off in little gobbets and filled his wounds with the big red ants. Having now, it seemed to him, seen his plight in clear terms, Sam faced the question whether greed or bloodlust would win. He saw now all the more reason why his escape, if he were to make one, should be as early as possible. It would be fatal for him if they took him to one of the larger villages, because there the squaws would tear the floor out of hell, and bloodlust would win. He studied the guard before him, praying that the villain would fall asleep. This hope was dashed when about 2 in the morning 2 fresh guards came to relieve him. The crafty chief was taking no chances. Of the 2 savages who now sat and faced him, Sam could have said only that they had black hair and eyes. Each had a rifle across his lap, a knife at his waist. Sam knew there could be no escape this night. In 2 hours, other guards would relieve these 2, and at the first gray of daylight he would march again. He probably would have to walk from daylight till dark, with no more than a cup or 2 of stinking soup to nourish him. The only thing to do was to try to sleep. He pushed his legs out and lay back, his face turned to the golden bark of a yellow pine tree. He closed his eyes. Even if he could not sleep, with snow melting under and over him, he could relax and doze, and that would be good. He thought an hour had passed when he felt a presence close to him. He smelt it. He smelt an Indian strong with the Blackfeet odor, but he didn't open his eyes and stare as a greenhorn would have done. If a savage had come over, eager to thrust a knife into him, he would need in his black heart only the most trivial excuse. He could say to his chief that the paleface had opened his eyes and leapt at him, and in self-defense he had struck. Telling himself as a warning that the red man was emotional, high-strung, impulsive, Sam allowed nothing in his face and posture to change, as a guard, drawn knife in hand, bent over him and studied his face. In his mind Sam had the picture. He could have leapt with his incredible speed, and even with bound hands he could have broken the man's neck. But that would only have brought on slow torture and death. There was nothing to do but pretend to sleep and trust in a being whose first law was justice. Sam would have said that the redskin bent over him for at least 5 minutes. Then the rancid odor went away. But even then, Sam didn't open his eyes or stir. The snow had been melting on his eyelids and face, and his eyes and face were wet. About 4 o'clock he actually sank into sleep, and slept until he heard the first movements at daylight. Chilled through and half frozen, he struggled to his feet and tried to shake moisture from his leather clothing. It was plain to him now that if he were going to make an effort to escape, it would have to be in the next 24 hours. He sank to the snow by the tree and waited. Chapter 23. His breakfast was another cup of soup. He thought the scraps of meat in it were dog or owl or crow. Today, as yesterday, the red men were all mounted, with the chief on Sam's bay. Again, Sam had to walk. This day and this night were like the former day and night. He had no chance to escape. His wily captors put the rope twice around the leather that bound his wrists, and both ends around the tree and over to the guards. His second night was 10 miserable chilled hours under storm and guards. The third day and night repeated the first and second, and Sam knew that after 2 or 3 more days like these he would be too weak to escape or to want to. He would make a move, even if it was desperate and useless. After camp was pitched, the chief came to Sam where he was tied to a fir tree and looked into his eyes. The redskin had on fresh war paint and more rancid grease on his hair. Nothing about him looked human, not even his eyes, for in his hideous face his eyes could have been those of a beast. There was in them no trace of the human or the civilized. They were the hard, glittering eyes of an animal looking at its prey. Sam thought the falcon must look like that when it moved to dive and strike. He hadn't expected the Indian to hit him, and when, with startling swiftness, the blow fell across his cheek, Sam's eyes opened wide with astonishment. Then he looked steadily at the creature before him, telling himself that if he escaped he would never rest until he had tracked this coward down. He again made note of the man's shape, height, weight, the length of his hair, the scars, and the exact appearance of his teeth when his lips parted to snarl. Sam had no notion of why the fool had come over to strike him. Years ago he had given up trying to understand the Indian male. Some infernal evil was busy in this man's mind and heart. The chief turned to shout, and there hastened over a brave who, like his boss, smelled of rancid grease and red bank war paint. The chief spoke to the brave as he came up, and at once this man stepped so close to Sam that his face was only 14 inches from Sam's face. He looked into Sam's eyes and made an ugly sound. Sam knew it was an expression of contempt. The warrior then said, "Brave, ugh," and again hawked the contempt up. Sam was startled. He hadn't known that any man in this party spoke English. "You're brave?" the redskin asked, and turned to spit a part of his contempt. Sam stared at the fellow, wondering if he was a half-breed. With signs and broken English, the warrior told Sam that for the chief he was a coward and a sick old dog. He was an old coyote, covered over with scabs and wood ticks. When the chief slapped him, he had challenged him to a fight. But here the pale-face stood, cowering and trembling. Were there any brave men among the pale-faces? Sam was silent. He knew that this was an Indian trick, but he didn't know the reason for it. It was a preposterous lie to say that the chief would fight him with fists, knives, or guns, or with any weapon. It was a trick. Was it some plan to cripple him so that he couldn't possibly escape, to hamstring him or blind him? Sam looked up into the storm and waited for what was to come. In his crippled English, the warrior was now telling Sam that they were going to ransom him to the crows. What the crows would do to him he tried to suggest by stripping fir needles and pretending that they were gobbets of flesh, and by pretending with a finger to slice his nose, lips, tongue, genitals until they were all gone. He indicated that the joints of fingers and toes would be broken one by one. With a piece of hooked wire each eye would be pulled out of its socket, and with a string tied around each eyeball he would be led through the village, while the squaws sliced off his buttocks and tossed them to the dogs. What purpose the creature had in mind with his catalogue of horrors, Sam didn't know. All the while the redskin talked and gestured, with glittering of his black eyes and guttural gloatings of joy. Sam's mind was busy. He now suspected that this band of warriors had been begging the chief to turn the prisoner over to them, and their share of rum, so that they could torture and drink and celebrate. The animal before him had worked himself into such a frenzy of maiming and bloodletting that Sam was afraid the frenzy might prove contagious. He decided to speak. He wouldn't speak as a normal man or in a normal voice. He would speak as the terror, as the man of all mountain men most feared by the red people, and as a great leader and chief. His first sound was a thunderous roar from his deep chest, and it came with such a shattering explosion that the astounded and terrified redskin almost fell backwards. The chief retreated with him, and there they stood. Two braves with their black eyes popped out as Sam flung his mighty arms toward the sky and trumpeted his disdain in his deepest and most dreadful voice. "Almighty God, up there in your kingdom, look down on your son, for he will be gone beaver before he will stand such insults. These cowards have about used up my patience. I will stand no more of it." Now, with a deliberate effort to astound and abash them, he swiftly puffed his cheeks in and out, to make the heavy golden beard dance and quiver over most of his face. He bogged and rolled his eyes, and they shone and gleamed like polished granite, and flinging both arms heavenward, he cried in a voice that could have been heard 2 miles away, "Almighty Father, I wasn't born to be slapped around and spit on, and the first thing I know I'll open up this red nigger and pull his liver out and choke him with it. Look down and give me the strength of Samson." He then burst into a crazy man wild hallooing and exulting that sent the 2 Indians and the guards into further retreat and brought into view all those in camp. The red men, drunk or sober, could raise an infernal racket, but such a trumpet-tongued deafening uproar of bombination and reverberation they had never heard. And while they all stared as though hypnotized, the golden-bearded giant began to jump up and down and contort himself like a monster in convulsions, his voice rising to a shrieking caterwauling that set the dogs to howling and the horses to whinnying. His fires, fed by enormous anger and contempt for these ill-smelling creatures who had him in their power, Sam simply turned himself loose and bellowed and howled out of him the emotions that had been filling him to bursting. All the while he was thinking of such things as Beethoven's sonatas in C major and F minor, and his own act he put on with such a shattering crescendo that even he felt a little unnerved by it. These unspeakable creatures had even taken from him his tobacco, his harp, and the lock of hair from the head of his wife, and they had fondled his revolvers and pointed them at him, and with his knife had made movements at his throat. They opened his baggage in plain sight of him, and with shrieks of delight had held up to view one thing and another, his moccasins, skins, flour, coffee, cloth, until he had gone so utterly filled with anger for their insolence and contempt and stinking soup that he could only unleash his whole being to the Almighty in a war song of menace and challenge, and get it out of him so that he could again breathe naturally. For a full 5 minutes he kept it up, his thunderous overture to the infinite, and then, covered with sweat, he stepped back and stood against the tree, arms folded on his chest, with his bound hands under his chin, his eyes looking at them. 58 pairs of black eyes were looking at him. Such a tempest of rage and challenge they had never heard from man or beast, and would never hear again. It was the chief who approached Sam. He came within 10 feet of him, and stood like a man who thought this bearded giant might explode, as the infernal spirit regions in Coulter's hell exploded. After studying Sam a full minute, he summoned the brave who spoke English. But Sam had the offensive, and he intended to keep it. He could tell that these superstitious children were not sure now whether he was man or some kind of god. So with prodigious gestures of menace and challenge, and a great roaring into the sky, Sam made them understand that he would fight any 5 of them in a fight to the death, all of them to come against him as one man, in full view of the Blackfeet people and 100 mountain men. And after he had slain the 5, the 100 mountain men would fight the whole Blackfeet nation, that 1,000 of them, or 10,000, or as many as the leaves on trees and the berries on bushes. He knew that his challenge would not be accepted, or even considered, but he had in mind a plan. He went on to say that if they were no braver than 6 squaws crawling in the sagebrush, or dying coyotes with their heads in holes, if they were no more than rabbits, if they were a nation of magpies with broken wings, they should take him to the sparrowhawks and get the thing over with. But if big ransom was what they wanted, tobacco and rum and guns and beads and bullets and coffee and sugar, they should ransom him to the mountain men, who would pay much more, and after he was set free, they could capture him again and sell him again. But whatever they did, they would all die like puking coyotes in their vomit, if they forgot for a moment that he was a great chief and a mighty one, who wore 50 eagle feathers in his headpiece, and he was to be treated with dignity and honors. And if he was not, all the mountain men would march against them and hunt them down to the last crippled dog. As before, the red man seemed hypnotized as Sam smote his breast and shot his arm skyward and poured out of his lungs the furious majesties of impatience and anger. As suddenly as he had begun, he stopped, and then roared at the pigeon brave, telling him to come forward if he weren't a coward hiding under a stink bush. The man advanced, slowly and with absurd caution, as if expecting Sam to blow him off the scene. Sam told him that he, Samson John Minard, was a chief, and a bigger and more important chief than the contemptible eater of crickets who had slapped his face. Sam said to tell him that he would raise his hair and pull his sandbag off if he didn't treat him the way a chief should be treated. Go, you quivering coyote, and tell him Chief Samson is to be put in a tent, as befits a great one, and given his pipe and tobacco. Sam knew he would get no tobacco. Once the smokers of kinnikinnick and cedar bark and willow got hold of white man's tobacco, they sucked it into their lungs day and night until it was gone. But he saw that he had aroused some of the warriors to clamorous proposals, and that the chief was talking things over with them. After a few minutes, the brave told Sam that a tent would be prepared for him and he would have a robe to lie on. A half-hour later, several braves came over and, untying the robe from the tree, led Sam like a beast to the tent. There he exploded in another deliberate tantrum. Flinging his bound arms widely, he said they would take the tether rope off his wrists, for did they think he was a horse to be hobbled and staked out? Hadn't they among their 58 one who was warrior enough to guard an unarmed prisoner? This taunt bore results. The chief had Sam taken into one of the larger teepees, and put as guard over him one, he was told, who had made a coup when only a boy, and had more flathead and crow scalps than Sam had fingers and toes. Sam then repeated his proposal, in words and signs, that they should ransom him to the mountain men, and then see if they were brave enough to capture him a second time for a second ransom. When first made, this proposal had fired the greed of some of the warriors. Their passions had caught flame like tall, dry prairie grass, as they foresaw innumerable kegs of rum and piles of tobacco. As children with little sense of the realities, they had no doubt that they could capture him a second time, or many times. And if there was to be so much firewater in the future, why not drink what they had just captured? This was what Sam had hoped for. Once thirst possessed their senses, there could be no prevailing against them. The chief knew that, but he was eager as any to unstop the rum and pour the liquid fire down his throat. He gave orders, and men rushed into the forest to find dead wood. Other braves made ready 3 elk, which had been killed that afternoon. As Sam watched the preparations, he tried to look sleepy and very hopeless. 5 gallons might not lay them all out senseless, but it was strong rum. 40 pints for 58 would average almost 11 ounces to the man. That ought to be enough. The rope had been untied from the leather that bound Sam's wrists, and he had been given a small thin rope that had lost most of its hair. On this, in the tent, he sat and planned and waited. The brave who had been sent in to guard him was taller and heavier than most Indians. Sam thought he stood an inch or two above 6 feet and weighed more than 200 pounds. He supposed that the chief had chosen one of his boldest and most dependable men, and one of the most savage, for this critter hadn't sat a full minute when, with Sam's bowie, he made passes across his throat. He took from his lap a tomahawk and made movements with it to show Sam how he would split his skull. His face expressionless, Sam watched the grim pantomime. Inside he was thinking, if my plan works, you dog-eater, you and me will be hugging before this night is over. Sam was weighing his chances in every way he could conceive of. The tent was about 10 feet across and about 8 feet high, where it was anchored to the center pole. If he were to move fast inside it, Sam told himself, he would have to bend over, for if his head struck the tent, the Indians outside might see the movement. The guard sat on a heavy robe. As he faced Sam, he was just to the left of the flap, which had been thrown open and back. There were 3 big fires blazing outside. The voices were shrill. The firelight cast flickering illuminations over the guard's face and gave a horrifying appearance of evil to his war paint. His right hand clasped the handle of the knife, his left the handle of the tomahawk. He had no gun. He was alert but tense. He had to turn his head now and then to peer out. Sam knew the man was burning with infernal thirst, and was wondering if he would share the rum or be forgotten. Oh, they would bring him a chunk of roasted elk, But would they bring him the water that turned a man into fire? If only he were the one who spoke some English, Sam could have talked to him and tried to make a frenzy of his resentment and impatience. As it was, he did nothing and said nothing. It would be best to look sleepy and tired. Sam was sitting straight across from the guard. Their faces were only about 6 feet apart, their moccasined feet only about 2. Sam's face was in shadow. He knew that the guard couldn't see him clearly, but Sam could see the emotions convulsing the guard's face. That Indian's belly was burning for rum. If they forgot him, he would be mad enough to grease hell with war paint before this night was over. The guard made no move that Sam's lidded eyes didn't see. During the first hour he had turned to look out at least once every 10 minutes. He was then looking out every 5 minutes, and at the end of an hour and a half he was looking out every minute or less, and the way he moved showed that he was itching with resentment and suspicion, and that his thirst was like hell's own. Nothing, Sam told himself, was more likely to make a guard think his prisoner secure than a boiling passion that took his mind off him and returned it and took it off again. Alcohol could do it. A female could do it. Alcohol, it now seemed to Sam, was the red man's curse, and woman the white man's. Just itch all over, Sam thought, his bound hands in plain view on his lap, his head sunk as though he were half gone in fatigue and sleep. Just itch, you bastard, and keep looking. Sam had never felt more brilliantly alert, as though all his senses and mind and emotions shone in the full blaze of noon sunlight. Never had his eyes been sharper. Just get yourself a thirst like that in hell, Sam was saying inside, and over calculated the risks and his chances. He figured that he had been sitting with a guard about 2 hours. For nearly an hour he had smelled the roasting flesh. He knew that tripods of green trees had been set up, and that hanging from them were the carcasses, slowly roasting in flames and smoke. Red men, when hungry, never waited for flesh to cook, but almost at once began to hack off bloody gobbets, and by the time their hunger was appeased, there wasn't much left but bone and gristle. Before long now these Indians would be drinking. Sam had hoped they would drink before they ate. Once they started drinking, they would have pictures of mountain men bringing them whole rivers and lakes of rum to ransom the crow killer, so that a second time they could capture him for more lakes and rivers. What dreams children dreamed! There now came to the door of the tent a face whose war paint had been smeared over with fresh blood. In this brave's hands was a piece of pine bark, on which rested a pound or 2 of hot elk meat. The guard set the meat by him and began to gesticulate and to talk in a high shrill voice, ill-becoming a bold, brave warrior. Sam knew that he was asking why he hadn't been fetched a cup of spirit water. The 2 braves gestured and yelled at one another, and the one who had brought the meat then went away. Sam didn't move or lift the lids on his eyes, for he knew that his moment was drawing near. Very gently he tried to ease his cramps and relax his muscles. In only a few moments the Indian returned with a tin cup in his hand. Sam knew that in the cup was rum. The guard eagerly took the cup and sniffed, and he was so enchanted that he laid the knife on his lap, and seizing the cup with both hands, put the rim to his lips. Sam's gaze was on the other Indian. He was praying that the fellow would go away. He had hoped that the guard would be alone with him when he drank, and that his first gulp would be so large it would strangle him. Sam was to say later that both his prayers were answered. The Indian in the teepee doorway, eager to get back to the drinking and feasting, did vanish, and the blockhead with the cup of rum did take such a huge mouthful that the fiery spirits choked him. He suddenly tightened all over and was fumbling to set the cup down when Sam moved with a swiftness that had become legendary. In an instant his powerful hands were on the red man's throat. Everything that he did now had been thought through over and over, so that there would be no false move or wasted moment. As hands seized the throat, a knee came with terrific force into the man's diaphragm, paralyzing his whole torso. In the next instant, Sam released the throat and his right hand seized the knife. He twisted his right hand around until he could put the blade to the leather and sever it, and the moment that was done, the left hand was back to the throat to be sure it made no sounds, and the right hand was gathering the robe, tomahawk, and piece of elk meat. He then slipped under the back of the tent into the gray-white night. In a flash he was gone across the pale snow and into the trees. Chapter 24. It was snowing hard. During the hours when he sat waiting for his chance, Sam had known that he would need the Almighty's help if he were to outrun the pursuit of 58 hell fiends and the bitter cold and deep snows of winter. His instincts told him that he was going east, but he wasn't sure of it. During this day's march, he had seen a range of mountains west of him, another north, and another east, and he had thought the range on the east was the Continental Divide. If it was, the Missouri River was only 40 or 50 miles east of it, and from there across the desolation to Kate was 150 or 200 miles. During his many hours of thinking and planning, he had recognized that it would be folly to go south over the trail up which they had come, or west to the Flatheads. His captors would expect him to take one of these routes. They wouldn't expect him to go north into Blood and Pagan Land, or to be fool enough to try to cross the divide after heavy snows had come. Earlier in the day, the war party had crossed the river, but he didn't know what river it was. He had never been through this country. He had heard that there were several rivers in this area, all of which came down from the divide and flowed west. Up one of these rivers looked to him like the only possible way to freedom. After he had trotted swiftly for 4 or 5 miles, he stopped to listen. He could hear no sounds. He put the piece of meat to his nostrils, for he was as famished as a wolf. While sitting and waiting, he had wondered if he ought to take one of the guard's thighs, but he was a sentimental man, and he thought he would rather starve than eat human flesh. He had calculated all the risks, and had decided that in starvation lay his greatest danger. He could hope to get his hands on little except roots, along streams, berries still clinging to bushes, a full hen possibly, fish now and then in a shallow pool, rose hips, marrow in old bones, or, if very lucky, a deer or an antelope stuck in deep snow. He was glad that it was snowing hard. He was singing inside at the thought of being free. He thanked God for both, and he thanked him for rum. He hoped that rum and rage would make 57 warriors so drunk that they would fall down and freeze to death. He thought he had heard bones snap in the guard's neck. If they found him dead, all hell would break loose. They would run round and round, and the dogs would be baying at their heels. But Sam doubted that they would take his trail before morning. They would think he had gone back down the path to the 3 Forks, and that they could catch him in a day or two, or they would think he had headed for his in-laws and would get stuck in deep snow. If it were to snow all night, they might not be able to tell by morning which way he had taken, but the dogs would know. There was a cold wind down from the mountains. He listened again, and thought he heard faint shrieks and dogs barking. but he couldn't be sure. His direction now was due north, and 2 hours before daylight he came to a river. Taking off his moccasins and leather leggings, he waded into the shallow stream and turned up it to the east, walking as rapidly as he could, in water only ankle deep or sometimes to his crotch. It was cold, but for a while it didn't seem cold. His blood was hot from exertion, his soul singing, his hopes high. He had yanked off the guard's medicine bag and was amazed to find in it his mouth harp. It was as if a brother had joined him, or Beethoven's ugly face up in the sky had smiled. When first captured, he wouldn't have given a buckskin wang for his life, but now, with God's help, he was a free man again, and he would remain free and alive, even if he had to live on tree bark. The red men might follow his path to the river, but there they would lose it, and 2 or 3 of them might go up river, but most of them would go down river. He couldn't, like John Coulter, find an acre of driftwood and lie under it for half a day and most of a night. He could only hoard his strength and keep going. Some of the river stones cut his feet, but he remembered that John's feet had been filled with cactus thorns. He was starved, but he told himself that Coulter had lived on hips and roots. Hugh Glass, with maggots swarming in his wounds, had crawled for 100 miles, and a man named Scott, starved and sick unto death, had dragged himself forward for 60 miles. And yonder Kate sat in the cold and sang. A man could do it if he had to. He recalled other tales of heroism and fortitude to warm and cheer him as he struggled up the river. Sam wasn't feeling sorry for himself. He wasn't that kind. He was not telling himself that he would perish. He was only warming himself with the feats of brave free men, his kind of men. Afraid that he was moving only about 3 miles an hour in his tortuous journey up the river, he looked round him, but there was no other way. Until daylight he would keep moving, and perhaps for an hour after daylight, for he thought it would take the red men half the morning to find his path and follow it to the river. He would find some snuggery back under the bank, an old beaver house, or a wash under an overhanging earth ledge, or a pile of driftwood, and he would hole up until night came again. He could catch a few hours' sleep if he lay on his belly, for in that position his snoring, Lotus had told him, was light. He would eat half the elk meat and all the rose hips he could find, and when darkness came he would be gone again. What he found was a high-water eddy underwash, under a grove of large aspen. The spring torrents had raised the river 4 or 5 feet above its present level, and the high water swirling round and round in the eddy had cut away the earth back under the trees. Sam crawled for 30 feet, and after putting on his leggings and moccasins and wrapping the robe around him, he cut off morsels of flesh and chewed them thoroughly. Never had elk tasted so good. Looking out the way he had come, he could see only a hint of daylight. If Indians were to wade up the river, as he had done, it was possible that they would spot his hideaway and crouch low to look back under, but they would never wade far in a river. They would think he had made a raft and gone downriver toward his in-laws, and by the time they discovered their error, he would be over the divide. All day until dusk he rested and slept a little, and heard no Indians, and saw nothing alive but one hawk. All day the snow fell. All night he took his slow way up the river. By midnight he had reached the foothills. By morning he was fighting white water. An hour after daylight he had found no hiding place, but in shallow pools he had caught a few small trout, a part of which he ate for breakfast, with a handful of rose pods. He was still struggling upward, on bruised and bleeding feet, when about noon he saw a cavern back in a ledge of stone. Its mouth was close to the river, with a wide shelf of spilled stones at the entrance. Leaving the river, he climbed up across talus to look in. The cavern was far deeper than he had expected, so deep, in fact, that his gaze went blind back in the gloom. He smelled wild beast odors and the odors of dove, bat, and swallow. After entering the cave, he stood under a ceiling 30 feet high and looked round him. At one side he saw a smaller cave that also ran back into gloom. This he explored to find a spot where he could lie down. The animal smells in the smaller cave were overpowering. They were so heavy and so saturated with mustiness and dust that he could feel them in his nostrils. Returning to the mouth of the cavern, he stood by a brown stone wall to give him protective coloring and looked back down the river. The falling snow was only a thin mist now, the kind that makes way for freezing cold. He could see far down the river's meandering course and across the valley. There was no smoke from Indian fires anywhere. He went down to the river for a water-washed stone on which to lay his meat and fish. Then, sitting in the cavern mouth, he cut off about 3 ounces of meat and ate it, and 2 fish no larger than his finger. Along the river banks he had gathered about a quart of rose hips. How a man could live and walk for a week on nothing but these, as some men were said to have done, he couldn't imagine. While looking round him he sneezed. The echoes of it startled him, for they were remarkably loud and clear. Impressed by the cavern's acoustics, he spoke, saying, "Hot biscuit," and sang a few bars of an old ballad. The echoing astonished and then alarmed him. It was somewhat like music from a great organ, rolling through vaulted chambers, with ceilings high and low. He burst into a Mozart theme, and the echoes rolling away from him into the far dark recesses sounded to him like an orchestra playing. He wondered if he was losing his mind. After he had found a spot where he could lie and try to sleep, he thought of the Rocky Mountains caverns he had explored, and of the strange sculpturing that water, wind, and time had made underground. "Almighty God," he said, and he liked so well the amplified and golden-toned echo that he uttered other words. "Dear Lotus, dear sun, Lotus," he said more loudly, and from all around him back in the stone mountains the word came back to him like an organ tone. Sam wasn't a man who usually felt gooseflesh in moments of danger, but he had been enfeebled by hunger and want of sleep. Gooseflesh spread all over him in the moment when he smelled the danger. Turning swiftly to a sitting position, tomahawk in one hand and knife in the other, he saw ambling toward him, not more than 50 feet away, a grizzly so large that it seemed almost to fill the cavern. In a flash, Sam knew that the reverberating echoes had disturbed the monster's slumber. Some were back in the gloom, and it had come to give battle to its enemy. That it intended to give battle, Sam knew the instant he saw it. The next moment he was on his feet, advancing, the hatchet ready to strike and the knife to plunge. He marched right up to the beast and smote the prow of the nose a crushing blow with the head of the axe. In an instant his arm came back and he struck again, and this time the blow fell across the sensitive nostrils. The big furry fellow said "woof, woof," and began to back off, with Sam after him, hoping for grisly stakes. But almost at once the beast vanished, and there was only the whimpering, plaintive sound of a frightened child as the shuffling furball hastened back to its winter bed. Pale from fright and weakness, and breathing hard, Sam watched it disappear. He felt for a moment that he was being tested with more than he could bear. Hungry, weary to the depth of his marrow, and numbed through with cold, he would now have to leave the cavern and go. There might be a whole pack of grizzlies back in the dark, and even if there were not, the whimpering one would nurse his injuries and come forth again. Over by the entrance, Sam stood for a few moments, looking out. He knew by the nimbus around the winter sun that the weather was going to change. After 7 days of deep storm, the temperatures would fall. Sometimes in this area it went to 30, 40, even to 50 below. Sometimes there were blizzards that not even the wolves and hogs could endure. There was cold that split trees open with the sound of gunfire, that froze broad rivers from bank to bank and almost to their bottoms, and the snow so hard that even the giant moose with its sharp hoofs could walk on it. It was cold that welded a man's hand to the steel of gun or knife if he was full enough to touch it. After searching the valley for a sign of Indians and seeing none, Sam looked up the river gorge to the continental backbone. After he had crossed the divide, the rivers would be flowing east instead of west, and he would be going down instead of climbing. With a robe flung across his left shoulder, the food enfolded by a piece of it and tucked up under an armpit, the hatchet in his left hand and the knife in his right, he scrambled down to the water's edge, sat and took off moccasins and leggings and trousers, and thrust wounded feet into the icy waters. Then he waded upstream. He guessed he might as well eat the remainder of the elk and the 3 small fish, and keep going and keep going. After he had gone a mile or two, he peeled the outer bark off a spruce and licked the juice of the cambium. It was resinous and bitter. Hank Caddy had said that, "Lessen a man has something better, he can live on it if he have to." The cambium itself Sam found unchewable, and so peeled off strips of it and licked the juice, as he had licked fruit juices off his hands as a child. While licking the juice he looked round him, wondering if there was anything else on this mountain that a man could eat. During the long miles up the river he had seen no birds except a hawk or 2 and 1 duck, no sign of grouse or sage hen, no sign of deer or elk trail. On the mountain slopes above him he could see no snow paths. The untramped, unmarked snow on either side of the river was about 3 feet deep. He wondered if it would be less exhausting to plow through it than to fight his way up over slippery boulders, in water from a foot to 3 feet deep. Wading in river waters up a mountain canyon was the most fatiguing toil he had ever known. He was sure he wasn't covering more than 2 miles an hour, but he kept at it doggedly all day long, pausing only when night closed round him. He then searched both banks, hoping to find a shelter in which he could sleep. But he found only an arbor under a dense tangle of berry vines and mountain laurel, over which the snow had formed a roof. He crawled back under it, out of sight. After putting on his clothes, he wrapped the robe around him, and lying on his left side facing the river, he put 2 fish on leaves a few inches from his face, hatchet and knife within reach, and in a few minutes was sound asleep. His first dream was of his wife. They were somewhere in Buffalo Land, and while she gathered berries and mushrooms, he cooked steaks and made hot biscuits. It was a cold night, and he slept cold, but for 8 hours he didn't awaken. It was the first solid rest he had had in a week. When at daylight he stirred, it took him a few moments to understand where he was. Then, like Jedediah Smith, he gave thanks to God, dwelled for a few minutes on the bones of his wife and child, yonder in the winter on a mother sitting in a pile of bedding, looking out at an empty white world, and then ate the 2 fish. Yes, it had turned colder. On the eastern side of the divide would be the wild storm winds down from Canada. There he would need more than a mouthful of frozen fish to keep him going. But he felt cheerful this morning, and he told himself that he was as strong as a bull moose. He thought he was safe from the Blackfeet now. Ahead of him lay an ordeal that might be the most difficult he would ever endure, but he would struggle through it day after day, all the way across the white winter loneliness, until he came at last to Kate's door. "Keep a fire for me and a light," he said, and faced into the sharp winds from the north.